been talking in the last few weeks, taking a closer look at the life of Jacob. And for some of you, I think it's been a different perspective. Some of you might have heard some of these things before, or it's not necessarily as new for you, but when we see Jacob as the man that he really is, and not the one that, as Esau accuses him to be, where he is rightly named Jacob, where he is a deceiver, a supplanter, who, he stole Esau's birthright, stole his blessing. When we stop seeing him like that and start seeing him more as the man of integrity and great faith in God, that changes how we approach some of even the following accounts of things. But you'll remember, that the traditional interpretation even affected translation, where we looked at this word. When the boys grew up, Esau became a man knowledgeable in the hunting. He was an outdoorsman. He was out running around all the time. While Jacob was a mild or quiet or plain man remaining in the tents. We took a longer look at that. How instead of a neutral word, the Hebrew word tam, meaning complete, whole, mature, or even blameless, conveying this moral integrity. And we looked at him in the sense of how he was going up to Laban, and where he first met Rachel, how he was a strong man in body, moving the stone, but he was also strong in mind and character, knowledge and ability. He was the kind of man because he stayed among the tents is what made him that kind of person. Because it was staying among the tents that he learned how to raise the sheep and the goats, learned what works and what does not, where he learned even about God and learned about his ways from his father Isaac, but also his grandfather Abraham, who was still alive until he was 15 years old. Jacob would have been put in charge a lot of times. He would have been sent out to manage the flocks by Isaac. But that created an interesting dynamic for him that was different for his own kids, because when Jacob was sent out to take charge over the flocks, was Esau there with him? Not likely. There were very few instances when Esau was hanging out with the flocks, because what kind of man is he? He's off hunting. He's the outdoorsman. He's off going around. So he was really the only one of his father's sons that was around. And that was different because, there were other servants, there were other people that were a part of the household, but was there ever any question who was in charge when Jacob was there? No. Jacob was the one in charge. He was the one representing his father. And that's different for the life of his sons. But see, in this Torah portion, Jacob, he is wanting to pass on his knowledge and the knowledge of his father to his favorite son, the son of the wife that he actually contracted for, the wife he agreed to marry, Joseph. He wanted to pass that knowledge on to him because he was the firstborn of Rachel. But when we look at Joseph, he was the one who was out and sent among the nations. This is the one that Jacob was investing his time, his attention in, was Joseph. And so of all of his sons, the one most qualified to go out among the nations and still carry with him the knowledge and the relationship with God, in many ways was Joseph. Because Joseph was the one that he loved. He was the one that he invested in. When you look at Genesis 37, it says, "Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his other sons, because he was the son of his old age, so he had made him a long-sleeved tunic." You might see the translations or the traditional things of the multicolored coat and tunic. And it's always kind of bugged me about this phrase, he was the son in his old age. Because, he and his brothers, all of them except for Benjamin, they were all born within 7 years of each other. Y'all realize that? That phrase has to mean something more than he was born in his old age, because that would make pretty much all of them born in his old age, right? Well, that helps, doesn't it? Thank you. He made them this long-sleeved tunic. So when you look at the timeline of things, Jacob goes up, he meets Rachel, he agrees to marry her, right? How long does he have to wait before he marries her? He waits for 7 years. He works for 7 years to essentially pay the bridal price for her. When the 7 years are up, he says, go and give me my wife, right? And things don't go as planned, do they? They don't go as planned. Because Jacob, he was content marrying how many women? Just one. That's what he wanted. That's what he contracted for. But Laban deceives him. He marries Leah first. How long was it after that until he married Rachel? How long? Well, he waited only how many more days to marry? He completed the time, so it was a week before he married Rachel. But in order to do that, he works another 7 years, right? But he works those 7 years not for paying for Leah. He pays for Rachel twice, right? He pays for her twice. And all of those sons up to Joseph were born in this time period, in this 7 years. Because after it says Jacob wants to leave, it says after Joseph is born, and we'll look at that verse here in just a moment, but Laban is the one who convinces him to stay. He wants to build up his household. Genesis 30, verse 25 says, it was after Rachel gave birth to Joseph that Jacob said to Laban, send me away so that I can go to my place and to my land. Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, and let me go, for you yourself know my labor that I have served you. Right? He has now worked for him for 14 years, and he has his children. He's like, okay, I'm done. I'm leaving. Let me get out of here. And he appeals to the fact, you know how I have worked for you. You know how hard I have worked. Did Jacob show up to work every day? Did he make Laban's life more successful? Absolutely he did. But Laban convinces him to stay, and so he works for another 6 years for all of those flocks and all the other things that he acquires at that time. And it's after that that he returns to the land, and it's essentially as they are leaving, or it's on their way back to getting settled, that Benjamin is born, right? And Rachel dies. And what's amazing is that Benjamin is not born until about here. He's not born until they're leaving, roughly. He has all of these children in this 7 years, and he only has one in this 6. That's how busy he was. That's what's going on in his life. So that favoring of Joseph in his old age, that phrase may mean that Joseph, more than any of his other children, reminded Jacob of himself. There was something about Joseph that was a lot more like Jacob than the others, and possibly even looked more like him. That's actually what is suggested in the Aramaic translation that was used in Yeshua's day, those Targums. It says that and Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons because the likeness of Joseph resembled his own, and he made him a figured robe. So there's something about Joseph that reminded him of himself. And Joseph, he's about 6 years old when the family leaves to return to the promised land. So he leaves when he's about 6 to 7 years old. And Joseph is sold down into Egypt at how old? Do y'all remember? It's when he's 17. So he has roughly 10 years when Joseph is actually in the promised land. Right? And it's what there in those time frames where, again, he's under Jacob's influence, but he's also there under Isaac's influence. That's something that we easily lose track of, is how the lives of these people overlap. You know, we talked about it a few weeks ago, that even when Jacob was born, Abraham was still alive. And that whole incident about the selling of the birthright traditionally is understood to be Abraham's funeral, is when that happens. And so Isaac is born back here. Their lives overlap a little bit, goes on, but Isaac is still alive when they come back from visiting Laban, having an extended vacation up there. Isaac is still alive, so he gets to meet his children. He gets to meet Joseph. And it's suggested that Isaac is still alive, but he is alive to see Joseph disappear. And he dies at some point while he is out there lost to the family. We sometimes forget that how these people's lives overlap. But it's during these periods that Joseph, begins to most resemble Jacob, not just in his looks, not just in that kind of outward appearances, but more than likely also in the way he conducts himself, in his mannerisms, in his character, and even his faith. Joseph has the kind of faith that his father Jacob does. Again, he's the firstborn of the woman that he loved first, the one that he would have been content with if it was just her. And so when he is given that multicolored coat or that long-sleeved tunic, however it's understood, it signifies that position. It signifies that favor. It's elevating Joseph. It's the kind of thing that the firstborn will be given to display like his status, his authority within the group. But it's this favoritism, this love, this special attention that Jacob gave to Joseph that creates this kind of jealousy and strife between him and his brothers. When you look back at verse 2 in chapter 37, it says, when Joseph was 17 years old, he was a youth. He was shepherding the flocks with his brothers. So at that point, Joseph is still being sent out from time to time with his brothers. But at this point, unlike what happened when Jacob was young and he was sent out to the flocks, right, there might be some question of who is in charge. Because the brothers weren't his servants. They were either his brothers, they were his same age, they might have even been older than him. They might have been the ones that thought they were the ones that should be in charge. There was question about that. There was question about who was going to be in charge in all these things. And this growing favoritism that Jacob is showing to Joseph, it's starting to show, but it's also starting to cause some trouble. Especially when you see that Joseph, in the end of verse 2, he brings back a bad report about his brothers to their father. He told Dad some things that they were doing that they weren't supposed to be doing. Have y'all ever had a sibling like that? A brother or sister who kind of spills the beans on what was happening when they weren't around? I was never a kid like that. I was one of two. I had an older brother. I'm sure I never tried to get him in trouble for anything. I'm sure. I was innocent. Right? Everybody's innocent, right? It's always somebody else's fault. Well, it didn't go over very well that he spilled the beans on what was going on. Verse 4 says, when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him. And they could not speak to him in shalom. They could not speak to him in peace. And by the time, all those family dynamics, by the time that gets to chapter 37, verse 12, it says, then his brothers went to graze their father's flocks at Shechem. And guess who's not with them? Joseph isn't. He's not going out with them at this point. Israel says to Joseph, aren't your brothers grazing the flocks at Shechem? Come, let me send you to them. Here I am, he said to him. So this favoritism, this special treatment, he was essentially keeping Joseph at home among the tents, kind of like he was. He was investing in Joseph and showing him the inner workings, the ropes, the ideal, the best way to do things. This favoritism, this special treatment, even the special clothes, that really would have probably been enough in its own right to create that kind of jealousy. But then Joseph starts talking about what? He starts talking about the dreams that he had. And those things, those dreams, really push things over the edge. I mean, this is what he says. Joseph dreamed a dream and told it to his brothers, and they hated him even more. He said to them, please listen to this dream I dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the middle of the field, and all of a sudden my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheaf. He says, will you truly be a king over us? His brothers said to him. Will you really rule over us? And so they hated him even more because of his dreams and because of his words. So these dreams that he had, then he has another one about even including mom and dad. But these dreams aren't just ordinary things, are they? They're also prophecy. They're prophecy about the brothers. They're prophecy about the family. They're prophecy about what God is going to be doing and who he is going to be doing and doing it through, who he is going to be working it through. It's the fact that not just the brothers, but even the whole family is going to be bowing before him. That's what really set everything off. Even Jacob had a hard time with that one. He dreams this other dream and told it to his brothers, saying, I've just dreamed another dream. Suddenly there was the sun and the moon and even the 11 stars bowing down to me. He told it to his father as well as his brother, and his father even rebuked him. Right? We talked about that a little bit already. And so there's this growing resentment and hostility about his position, about who he is and who he is going to be and who's really in charge here. And so when Jacob tries to put Joseph in charge of the brothers, they reject it. Because again, they were his brothers, not his servants. And that's something that Jacob had not experienced. Y'all know what that can be like, though. You know, it's hard to have the younger brother or younger sibling put in charge. It's hard to have the new guy put in charge of the older and more experienced. You know, those are typical kinds of things. But these reactions that are had when he goes and finds his brothers. It says they saw him from a distance, and before he was close to them, they plotted together against him in order to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes the master of dreams. Come on now, let us kill him and throw him into one of these pits, so we can say that an evil animal has devoured him. Then let's see what becomes of his dreams." They're going to work hard to make sure that his dreams don't come true. Right? But the tricky thing is everything they do does what? The opposite. Everything they do to him is what actually ensures that his dreams come true. Joseph had his dreams about those sheaves, about his brothers bowing down. And this is actually an important lesson for us. Because everything about those dreams was 100% true. Aren't they? Everything about those dreams was true. Everything about those dreams was from God. And we don't want to forever lose track of that. We don't want to lose that reality. Everything was true and from God, but how was that truth received by his family? Not very well. Y'all have had that experience before, right? Where God shows you something. I mean, you're here in this place, and in some respects, not all your family is here with you, right? Sometimes God reveals things and brings things to your attention that you didn't know before. And it's not always received well when you try to share it. They hated him even more. I got a little ahead of myself here. "Will you truly be a king over us?" his brothers said to him. "Will you truly rule over us?" They hated him even more because of his dreams and because of his word. Everything that Joseph said was true. But it was not received well by those that were closest to him. And that's something that we have to grapple with in our own lives sometimes when we are sharing the things that we have learned. We need to understand that just because something may be true, that God shows us, that God teaches us, does not mean that that's enough for others to accept it. Right? Even when it's true, that may not be enough. Now, some would suggest in these moments that it's Joseph's immaturity, that it's Joseph's arrogance or something else like that, that he had some kind of spirit of haughtiness, of superiority, of pride that caused his brothers to reject what Joseph said. And that may be the case. But I mean, there's already enough going on in these family dynamics that would cause them not to want Joseph to be elevated above them. Just in normal family dynamics across the board, the rivalries between siblings would be enough by itself. But then when you add in favoritism, then when you add in other elements of rivalry between all the women involved, I mean, all of that stuff makes it very complicated. Those are the kinds of things, I mean, some of those things happen in our day where we see those kind of rivalries and jealousies and rejections. We've seen people, we've known people. Sometimes we've been that person that speaks a little too arrogantly of what we know, right? Let me tell you what I know, what I've learned, which is so much more, so much better than you ignorant people out there, right? I've been that person before. And we can come across that way sometimes, even unintentionally. We can come across that way. It may be things that we say may be interpreted that way, and they may be things that we say that are true, hopefully they are, and they can still be taken that way. But we also really have to be willing to fight that attitude in ourselves, because we can get that way pretty easily when we think we know something that others do not. And it's that attitude that can hinder the truth in us. We don't want to be that person in dealing with people who maybe don't see what you see yet. We need to be patient with everyone. We need to speak the truth with humility and with grace. We don't want to assume some fault in them. We don't want to assume some sin or failing on their part. That arrogance or that immaturity, that might be the case. It's not the only possible explanation. And this is the hard part, is that Joseph could have done and said everything right, even with the correct and humble spirit, and could it have still been rejected? Sure. Maybe it's because of somebody else. Maybe they rejected Joseph because they were really mad at Dad for showing that kind of favoritism and giving him special treatment. Maybe it's also a matter of timing is a reason why it's rejected. It's not the right time. Not everything is in place yet for the message to be received. And again, that's more and more I'm thinking that this is the real reason why the brothers rejected the dreams. Their rejection of the dreams contributed to them imprisoning Joseph. Their rejection of it contributed to them selling him down into Egypt. That would not have happened at all if they really believed what Joseph said. They wouldn't have done that if they believed it. If they did believe his dreams, none of those things would have happened. It was not the right time. Not everything was in place. Not everyone was included yet for the truth of Joseph's dreams to come to pass. Because the fulfillment of Joseph's dreams was actually much bigger than even Joseph thought. Joseph did not have everything figured out. Joseph was thinking in terms of his immediate family, the sheaves, the stars, his parents, things like that. But God had in mind the multitudes of the Gentiles. God had in mind all of Egypt itself. He had in mind the nations. God had in mind to submit Pharaoh to Joseph. God had in mind to even submit Egypt's gods to this situation. Even the gods were eventually going to submit to what he was doing in and through Joseph. And the sun and the moon, those are pretty prominent in the Egyptian world, right? So what God was planning on doing was a lot bigger. And none of that would have happened without the rejection by the other sons of Jacob. The blessing never would have come to the Gentiles, to Pharaoh. He would never had someone there to interpret his dreams, to prepare Egypt for the drought, be able to save those same brothers at a later time if they actually believed when Joseph tried to tell them the first time. In a lot of ways, that sounds like early church history, doesn't it? That sounds like what happens in the life of Messiah. In a lot of ways, it's like Romans 11. He says, I say then, did they not stumble so as to fall? And talking about the Jewish people and their rejection of Yeshua. He says, may it never be. They did not stumble so far as that God is done with them. But by their false step, salvation has come to the Gentiles to provoke Israel to jealousy. Now, if their transgression leads to riches for the world and their loss riches for the Gentiles, then how much more their fullness? Something happened. Something was able to happen that wouldn't have happened on its own. He says, I am speaking to you who are Gentiles, insofar as I am an emissary to the Gentiles. I spotlight my ministry. If somehow I might provoke to jealousy my own flesh and blood and save some of them. Yes, there was this false step. Yes, there was this rejection. But does Paul want them to stay in that state forever? No. Is he hoping that that dream, so to speak, comes to pass in the right way at the right time? He says, for if their rejection leads to the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? Something amazing is going to happen when those dreams are fulfilled, not to our own expectations, but when they are fulfilled to God's expectations. When things happen to the level that He wants to make them happen in. The brothers, their rejection of Joseph led to the salvation of that whole part of the world through him. And when Joseph fully revealed himself, when they finally did recognize their brother, there was great joy. There was also great weeping, and even some great amounts of fear among some of them for what had happened. But it also resulted in salvation for the whole family. The rejection of Yeshua by the leadership of the Jewish people likewise led to the salvation of the world through the Messiah, and we often call him Messiah ben Joseph, the son of Joseph. And there is going to be a day when Yeshua is fully and completely revealed and he is accepted by his brothers. You know, there's a whole lot of parallels between Joseph and Yeshua. And some of y'all have seen some of these. But some of the parallels between him and Messiah Yeshua, he was unjustly rejected by his brothers. John chapter 1 puts it like this: He was in the world, and the world was made through him, but the world did not know him. And he came to his own, but his own did not receive him. But whoever did receive him, those trusting in his name, to these he gave the right to become children of God. Jewish people, when they would read that intro, when they come to this idea of he came to his own, but his own did not receive him, guess what they could think of? Guess what story they would know so well that they're like, wow, that's just like what happened to Joseph. So he was unjustly rejected. He was thrown into a pit, cut out of the earth, which should have ended in his permanent stay, right? Yeshua was likewise put into a hole cut into the earth, into the stone. And by all practical means, he should have stayed there. It should have ended in his permanent death. But just like with Joseph, he was raised out of it. He talks about him being sold for silver. We see that in chapter 37. The Midianites merchants were passing by. They dragged Joseph out. This is verse 28. Up and out of the pit, and they sold Joseph to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. They brought Joseph to Egypt. It talks about him being stripped of his robe. That thing that his father had given him was taken off, taken from him. He was raised up to essentially a new kind of life and carried off into the Gentiles. But the Lord was always with him. And he was blameless in his actions and his behavior. That was one of the things that was there about Joseph that was said about Yeshua. There was no real basis of accusation against him. The Father even used him to bless others through him. Look at chapter 39 of Genesis. It says, "Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an official of Pharaoh, a commander of the bodyguards, bought him from the hand of the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. But Adonai was with Joseph, and so he became a successful man in the house of his master, the Egyptian. His master saw that Adonai was with him, that Adonai made everything he set his hand to successful." Who is this Egyptian even giving credit to? Is he giving it credit to Joseph? No, this Egyptian is giving credit to the Lord, giving credit to Adonai. He recognized that Adonai was with him. So was Joseph silent or quiet about who and what he believed in? No. He still carried himself with that faith, with that belief, while he was down there in Egypt. He carried the name of the Lord with him. It says Joseph found favor in his eyes, so he served him as a personal servant. He made him an overseer over his household. Everything that was his, he entrusted into his hand. And from the time that he made him an overseer in his house and over everything that belonged to him, Adonai blessed the Egyptian's house because of Joseph. Adonai's blessing was on everything that belonged to him in the house and in the field. So through Joseph's presence, the Lord was blessing the Egyptian. But in that situation, some of these other parallels, like Yeshua had a time of temptation and testing, Joseph did as well, in which he was resisted, and he showed faithfulness to the Father. It says Joseph, after these things, the master's wife lifted up her eyes at Joseph and said, "Come and lie down with me," but he refused. He's resisting that temptation. "Look," he said to his master's wife, "my master doesn't think about anything in the house with me in charge, and in everything that belongs to him he is entrusted into my hand. No one in this house is greater than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. So how could I commit this great evil and sin against God?" He's resisting temptation. He's showing his faithfulness to God in all of his actions, in all of his life, in all of his behavior. And even when he's trying to do everything right, that doesn't mean everything goes the right way, or what we would understand it. Because just like Yeshua, Joseph had false witnesses that accused him of things that did not happen, of things that were not true. It says she kept the garment with her, this is his wife again, until his master came home, and she spoke the same words to him, saying, "The Hebrew slave that you brought us approached me to fool with me. When I raised my voice and screamed, he left his garment with me and fled outside." She's not telling the truth. A false witness was testifying against him, and they wanted the false witness to be believed even more. The false witness accused, and that drew an unjust conviction and a sentence of suffering. These are all different ways that parallel the life of Joseph to the life of Messiah. It says in verse 16, when his master heard the words, his wife spoke to him, saying, "Such are the things your slave did to me." His anger burned. Then Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. So there he was in the prison. There is a reason why there are those two descriptors of Messiah in Jewish thought. The one that is best known is Messiah ben David, son of David, the reigning and ruling king. The other one is this Messiah, the son of Joseph. the suffering servant, the one who was lost among the nations, only to return and bring life. That's actually what the next Torah portion is going more into. How Joseph went down into Egypt, but he always carried with him that integrity, his faith, that faith in God, that faithfulness to God and his ways. Because even when he did all of that, even when we try to do that in our life, sometimes, Joseph down there became unrecognizable to his brothers. They did not recognize him. They did not see him for who he really was. Even holding on to God's ways, Joseph was not recognized by his brothers. And what's also interesting is that the Egyptians never really accepted him either as one of them. But he had to live and operate in their world. The hard part with Yeshua is that he too, for centuries, has been unrecognizable by his brothers. The Jewish people, after Yeshua was taken out among the Gentiles, among the nations, they don't see him as one of their own anymore. Many Jewish people think of Jesus as a pagan deity that they don't recognize him as Jewish, because in many ways the early church deliberately removed so many of those Jewish markers and identifiers from our faith and our practice. And many Jewish people are surprised when they actually read the New Testament for the first time, because it's so Jewish. They recognize so many of the things that are going on, so many of the stories, so many of the themes, so many of the names, so many of the things that are going on. And really, that's so much of what we're trying to do here at Restoration. We're trying to make sure that Yeshua's brothers can recognize him for who he really is, their Messiah. That they don't have to even stop being Jewish in order to believe in him. We also want to help Gentile believers in Jesus to remove those things from our faith and from our practice that reject, those things that conceal his Jewish identity. We are the wild olive branch. We are grafted into what is called a cultivated olive tree. God did the cultivating of the olive tree, making the nation of Israel. We are the wild branch, the uncultivated. We are grafted into that cultivated olive tree of Israel. And when we are cultivated in, guess what? We don't make the tree wild all of a sudden. The tree doesn't all of a sudden go from being cultivated to uncultivated. The wild is supposed to go from being wild to what? We're supposed to go to being cultivated. We're supposed to reflect more of that cultivation. Something that changes the cultivated root, the cultivated tree is supposed to tame and change our wild nature into something that is productive for the kingdom of God. And even though many Jewish people, talks about being in Romans, being broken off by unbelief, by rejection of Yeshua as Messiah, the heart of God is to always bring them back. Romans 11 puts it like this: for if you were cut out of that which by nature is a wild olive tree and grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these natural branches be grafted in to their own olive tree? It should be a lot easier for them to come to believe in Yeshua, because that's what is natural. They should recognize him as one of their own. And this is really God's goal of where he is taking all of us. He wants as many wild olive branches grafted into this cultivated olive tree as possible, right? But he also wants all of these natural branches that may have been cut off by unbelief, he also wants them to be grafted back in too. That is God's goal. And so if that's his goal, that also needs to be whose goal? That needs to be our goal. And so we need to come to that point as well as a people. And we need to seek and try to pursue that truth, that Yeshua and his Jewish identity, not be rejected by either Jew or Gentile because of our pride or because of our arrogance or because of something that we're doing. Instead, we need to pray that maybe it wasn't the right time before, but we need to seek that maybe it's the right time now. We need to pray and live for that goal that maybe now is the time. Pray that this is the time when Messiah, the son of Joseph, who has been hidden among the nations, is fully revealed to his brothers. That's where the story is going. And that's the kind of people that we need to be, to where we are not hindering that, but highlighting that truth and that reality. Amen.